Well, good morning, everybody. I know Kim gave you a little introduction to me beforehand, but I was just going to add a little bit more maybe to that, so kind of how I got to Grace. I actually live 2 houses down from the church office, and so my family moved here in May of 2017. Holly Chapman was actually the first contact I had at Grace when I called to ask her if we could park our U-Haul in the church parking lot. And she graciously said yes. So that was our first contact with Grace. After we had been here a couple of months, my son, who turned 16 last Monday, said, "Mom, could you ask the church if they have any youth programs going on?" So I went down and I talked to Holly again, and she said, "Well, my brother-in-law does the youth program, so here's his number, give him a call." And he had just taken over the youth program, and so that summer, Bobby and Mary were actually doing a family service almost in the refuge, and so they had kids and parents together so they could talk about what they were doing with the program. So our first ministers at Grace were Bobby and Mary, and we absolutely adored them, and so that kind of kept my son going, and we went around and tried different churches, and we ended up staying here at Grace. So we actually joined Grace last summer, at the end of last summer, after Brent had got here as well. So that's what got me to Grace. And then in the fall, or in the late summer, I talked to Kim. I decided I do teach, but I've never taught in this atmosphere, and I decided I needed to step out of my comfort zone a little bit, and so I talked to Kim about that, and I help on Tuesday night leading a discussion group, and then here I am teaching you all today. So new experience for me, but last night I did it and it turned out to be great, so hopefully today it will as well. So today we want to talk about what we're reading in Malachi 2, but I want to start you off with the story of a man named Elie Wiesel. So if you have never heard that name before, Elie Wiesel was a Nobel laureate author. He was also a university professor and a political activist. But most notably, he was a Holocaust survivor. At the age of 15, he and his family, which included his mother, his father, and his 3 sisters, were deported from their home in what is now Romania and sent to the concentration camps in Germany. They first went to Auschwitz, which when people came in, 90% of the people that entered Auschwitz were killed upon arrival. And that included his mother and his younger sister. His other sisters were sent off to another camp, and he and his father stayed at Auschwitz for some time before they were moved to Buchenwald, where his father died just before the camps were liberated. After liberation, he ended up coming to the United States, and in the course of his lifetime, he authored 57 books. Most of those books focused on the Holocaust, and they were very, if you've ever read any of them, you know there's a great amount of him in those books. His struggle and what he went through is put in there. That's a very powerful message that he shares. One of the books that he wrote is called The Trial of God, and it is said to be based on an experience that he had in the Auschwitz camp. One night in the camp, there were 3 rabbis that were close to death in a cell, and they decided they were going to put God on trial. Sounds very similar to what we see happening in Malachi's time. So they charged God with working against the covenant that was made with his chosen people, and they accused him of being the one responsible for their suffering. So we see this in Malachi as well. The Israelites are also charging God. They too want to know why. They want to know where their justice is, and they want to know where God is in their suffering. Well, Wiesel said that he witnessed this trial, and when it ended, the rabbis did not declare God guilty. Instead, they declared him chayev, which is a Hebrew word that means must, should, bound, or obliged. So just like the Jews that we see in Malachi's time, these rabbis felt that God owed them something. But we know that God owes us nothing. Now, it's not unprecedented for people to go and put God on trial. In 2007, an agnostic state senator by the name of Ernie Chambers from Nebraska filed a lawsuit against God, charging him with making and continuing to make terroristic threats of grave harm to innumerable persons, including constituents of the plaintiff. So the suit went on to blame God for every bad thing in the world, natural disaster, disease, and death that befalls people. It sounds a little bit silly to go forth and say, I'm going to put God on trial. But if we think about ourselves, we probably put God on trial every day. We want to know the same things that the Israelites wanted to know. We want to know the why. We want to know the what. We want to know, where is God in our suffering? And like those rabbis, there may be times when we feel that God owes us something. And there's a lot of biblical precedent for that. As we go through the Old Testament, the rabbis were following what they had learned in their teaching. The Psalms are full of laments and cries out to God for answers. Job is a classic example of taking God to task. And even in the New Testament, we see Jesus, as he hangs on the cross, crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then there's this book of the prophet Malachi, the last book in the Old Testament. It's a courtroom drama where the people, after all that has happened to them, the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of their temple, 70 years in exile, are crying out to God. They're taking him to court, and they want to know that God owes them something. Well, last week and this week, the people stated their case against God. In chapter 1-2, they accused him of not loving them. And in chapter 2, they rail against God for letting the wicked prosper while not granting them justice. In verse 17, Malachi tells us, you have wearied the Lord with your words. How have we wearied him, you ask? By saying, all who do evil are good in the eyes of the Lord, and he is pleased with them. These are the cries of people who think that they deserve more, that they are in their right, and that God is against them unfairly. Well, like I said, we tend to ask those same questions of God. We tend to think sometimes that we are better and more righteous than the next person, even if that person is God. We want to put him on trial, and we want to believe that he owes us something. But under cross-examination, we come to realize just how little God owes us and how much we do not deserve what he gives us. The people of Israel were probably not ready for God's answer. He came down from the judgment seat and he stood before them and he began his cross-examination of Judah. His judgment asked them, do you want justice? Do you think that you are owed something? And the truth is, like that state senator in Nebraska, the people of Israel were agnostic when it came to dealing with God. They doubted, they questioned, they challenged the Lord. They wanted him to bring justice, but most of the time they just ignored him. They acted as if he didn't exist. And the justice that they wanted was not the justice they deserved. So God then leveled several countercharges against the people, charges that really go towards our tendency to pay lip service to God. The first charge comes against the priests, and it is a charge of lack of leadership. God reprimands the priests for not following the Levitical covenant. Now, God promised in this covenant to provide for the family of Levi, while the priests, who all descended from the line of Levi, are expected to let God lead them and live beyond reproach so that they can stand in the gap for their people. The priests in Malachi's time were not above reproach, and they did not seem to be led by God. They lost their faith in God to provide for them, and in an effort to take control, they were willing to accept substandard sacrifices and to allow their people to live in a manner that was unpleasing to God. This lack of faith by the leaders trickled down to the people, and they began to practice the same substandard practices. They began to take on that role and do the same thing that they were being taught to do. And that's where the second charge comes in. And that one is against the people. And that charge is a lack of love. So the Israelites weren't just being unfaithful in their religious practices, they were being unfaithful socially as well. Divorce was common in the land, and God hated it. Now that seems like a strong statement when you read that, but those are God's words. And that hate stemmed from disobedience and from defiance. The divorces that were occurring in the land were often for very frivolous reasons. People were leaving their believing wives and marrying unbelievers. And this broke more of God's laws. In Proverbs 10:17, the same as we see in Malachi, the Israelites rejected God's rules and the repercussions that he imposed because of that. They lost their faith, and that led them to lead their own brothers and sisters away from God instead of heeding God's instructions. So how do those charges relate to us today? Well, with Christ as the leader of our lives, we no longer have to abide by those laws that were given to the Old Testament Jews. God will dwell among us because we believe in Christ. Now, it doesn't mean that we can go out and do whatever we want, right? We can't just have all the fun in the world. But what it means is that the sacrifices and the offerings and the ritual eating, all those things that were prescribed to them are not prescribed to us. We don't have to follow that in order to find God. As Brent tells us on Sunday morning, by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone, we are saved. So Christ is the priest that stands in that gap for us. But does this mean that we don't need a priest here in this world with us? And if we do, who fills that role? Is it just a man that can be a priest? Well, the author of our study and the author of the Bible show us that it's not just a man. It can be anybody. It can be a man, it can be a woman, it can be a child. All you need to be is led by God to lead the people of God. Now, there's no way of getting around that statement that God hates divorce. He says it and he means it. But when we look at that in the context of the Israelite society, we see that divorce really meant more than just a man leaving his wife. The Israelites were divorcing each other, and they were also divorcing God. Their lack of faith separated them from the love of God and from the love of one another. In Matthew 22, the Jewish leaders are questioning Jesus. They're trying to trip him up. They're trying to get him to say something that goes against the law so that they can get rid of him. And so one of the leaders says to Jesus, well, if you're so wise and you know God so well, then what's his greatest commandment? And you can just kind of picture him, nodding. His friends are nodding. Yeah, that's a good one. Way to go. Yes. But Jesus turns it around and he trips them up. And he tells them in verses 35 through 40 that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord, your God, with all of your mind and all of your heart and all of your soul. And just as they get ready to say, yeah, but, Jesus says, and the second greatest commandment is to love one another. And all of the law and all of the prophets, all of the teaching that they knew was based on those two commandments. So the word love in those verses stems from the Greek word agape. And agape is defined as to honor, respect, and revere, indicating a direction of the will and finding one's joy in something or someone. So in other words, everything from the beginning of creation rests on choosing to find joy in God and to share that joy with others. Malachi's Israel has lost that agape feeling. They're disappointed. They're discouraged. They're rejected. They are burdened. They're worried. And God is shouting to them, just as he shouts to us in Revelation 3:20. Here I am. I am standing at the door and I knock. But they refuse to open the door. Unfortunately, their failure to reciprocate God's invitation leads them to 400 years of silence. God simply stops knocking. Now, in one of the most stirring passages of Elie Wiesel's memoir, he describes an execution that he witnessed in Auschwitz. And the execution was of several people, including a child, and it was by hanging. And while the others died quickly, the child was not heavy enough, and so it took a long time to die. And Wiesel writes, "And so he remained for more than half an hour, lingering between life and death, writhing before our eyes, and we were forced to look at him at close range. He was still alive when I passed him. His tongue was red and his eyes not yet distinguished. Behind me, I heard the same man asking, 'For God's sake, where is God?' And from within me, I heard a voice answer, 'Where is he? This is where, hanging here from this gallows.'" For Elie, the sight of that innocent suffering showed to him that God was dead. He closed his door, and he went on and spent his life as an agnostic in his own 400 years of silence. Thankfully, we know that he was wrong. Now, I can't begin to imagine the horrors that he saw in his life, but I also can't imagine that God was not with him through his suffering. That's because the New Testament has told me and told us of another child. It's God's child. It's God himself who also hangs from the executioner's stand. When we stand in the midst of our suffering and ask, "Where is God?" we can point to the cross and we can say, "There he is." And we know that he is alive. He did it for us and we didn't deserve it. He owed us nothing, but yet he came to set us free. So God is not removed from our suffering. He takes it on himself. He takes on all the pain and the sin and the death, and he puts it in his body so that we can live. God, the righteous judge, stepped down from the bench, and he became the accused for us. As Paul puts it, he who knew no sin became sin so that we might become his righteousness. He answers our suffering with his own, and through the cross, we find new life. So how do we check ourselves to be sure that we don't squander that new life as the Israelites did? How do we hear that door knocking so that we can answer it? Lamentations 3:40 tells us to examine our ways and test them, and let us return to the Lord. The prophets call us to put our faith in God, the one who comes for us. We must be faithful to the one who has been faithful to us all the way to the cross. Now, before I ask you to dig into your chaos, I feel that it's only fair that I share a little bit of mine. And so somebody got my picture on your handout. That's my chaos down there in the bottom. That's my picture. I imagine I would like nice, neat little squares and lines, but it doesn't always happen that way. So I didn't come to God as a child. My father hated God, and my mother just really didn't care. And that's what I learned at home. So my father was a Vietnam veteran, and I can't imagine what he experienced in that time in his life. He was one of the first boots on the ground, and I know the man that he was before he went there was not the man that came home. Other than that, I don't know a lot about that experience. If my father ever had faith in God, he lost it on that battlefield, and he lost much more. My parents were people that never expected to live the life that was given to them. Neither one of them ever had plans to get married, and neither one ever had plans to have children. But here I am. God has a way of turning that around. My childhood was emotionally abusive. I was never good enough. I was berated. I was called names. I was shamed. I was blamed. I was verbally assaulted every day. I lived my own 400 years of silence because I learned if I was quiet, I was often forgotten, and life was easier that way. My mother, who at one time had followed God, but after years of living with my father, who hated God, kind of fell under that spell. And she adopted an attitude of apathy toward God. She manipulated me. She tried to control all of my thoughts. I was not held. I was not hugged. I was not told that I was loved. And I never was told that God loved me. Yet here I am. My father died in the late summer of 2010. And shortly after that, I had to make a decision. And that decision was to end my relationship with my mother. I was 36 years old at that time. And I would love to stand here and tell you today that that decision made everything better. That removing my mother from my life solved all my problems. But I can't tell you that. I struggled for years with that choice. A little over 8. And if you add that up, that's pretty recently that I actually started to deal with it. Over the past year, my family, my husband, my son, and myself have gone through our own season. We fell into a bleak winter, and at times I didn't know that we were going to get out of it. But I knew I had God, and I knew that He could help me, and I would cry out to Him, and I would ask Him, why, God, and what, and how am I going to fix it? And God told me, you don't fix it, I fix it. That's my job. You be still. You know that I am God, and I've got it. And so God does have it, and it may not be fixed, and it may not be perfect, but He's got it for us. So just like the Israelites, we came to realize as a family that it wasn't just one person's problem, but it was all of us. And we were all part of that problem. But we could also all be part of that solution. And as we see in Malachi, we know everybody is part of that problem. The priests and the people are all part of it. And God knew that if they would just search their hearts, that they could find that. He tells them, you guys are a mess. In verse 2, Malachi tells us they did not listen. They did not honor His name. If they were honoring God, they would also be honoring God's covenant with Levi. In verse 5, he tells us that covenant is a covenant of life and peace. So, as we go into the outline today, and we see kind of the start of finding that solution, the solution that would have worked for the Israelites, and hopefully the solution that works for all of us. It's the start of what I'm working on in my own life, and I hope that whatever it is that you need to work through in your life, it will help you as well, so that in the end we can all follow God's instruction, as in Malachi 2:16 says, be on our guard and not be unfaithful. So, let's go on to our handouts. How do we take action on this? Most of us probably don't like to look too closely at ourselves, right? When we joined Grace Bible Church, we had to share our testimony with somebody. So that might have looked different for everybody. Maybe you just sat down and you told your story. Maybe you did what I did and you wrote it out. I sat down and 6 pages and 3,000 words later, Brent got his file that said, here you go. Enjoy your reading. Last week, one of our Tuesday night leaders, when we were in our leaders group, brought up that subject of testimonies and said, do they end after you type that final period? Hopefully not. Because you're going to keep growing with God, and you're going to keep getting stronger in God, and that just keeps adding to your testimony. It's not a file that you store on your computer. It's a living, breathing document that you take out into the world with you every single day. So like I said, mine has over 3,000 words in it, including what I told you about my childhood. But other than that, when I look at it, how many of those words are really about me? Well, there's probably not as many as there should be. And the words that I do put in there focus on the character I want people to see about me, the face that I put on to the world, not my chaos that actually exists inside of me. So you might look at that and you go, well, that might be great for you, but if you knew me, if you knew the real me, you'd say something different. It wouldn't be the same thing for me. Well, it is. And here's the great thing about that. God knows the real you. He knows the real me. He knows the real every single one of us. And you know what? He still loves us. Whatever that chaos is that goes on inside of us, he loves us with all of it there. Now, the goal is to get that chaos out, right? So we have to kind of take inventory of ourselves and figure that out. So does anybody here have dogs? Yes? Okay. So I have 2 dogs, and they like to eat. They're hungry dogs. So, you know, I go to the dog food, I go to the store, I might go to PetSmart, I might go to Walmart to get their dog food, and I have to get a big bag of dog food because they're going to eat a lot. I don't want to have to go every 3 days. So I go and I get my big bag of dog food, and, you know, sometimes that's all I'm getting, and I go, I don't need a cart, I'm just going to carry that on up there and pay for it. So I get my dog food, right, and I carry it up, and I'm waiting in line, and as you're waiting in line, that bag that wasn't so heavy gets heavier and heavier and heavier, and then you're going, okay, well, what do I do with it? And you know, and then you remember, and then I need this, and so what do I do with this? Do I carry the bag and go get what else I need and add more to my burden, or do I put my bag down? Well, if I put my bag down, what's going to happen? Someone's going to take my bag of dog food, because you know everybody needs that one bag of dog food. So I don't want to put it down. I'm going to carry it around with me. And everywhere I go, I'm carrying that bag of dog food around. Well, God tells us in Matthew 11, come to me those who are weary and who have heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. He wants our bag of dog food. But if we give that to him, what do we have left? If I take out all the baggage in me, what's really inside? And that baggage, it's mine. But it's also my parents. When I left, I took their baggage with me. And now I have this 16-year-old son. So now when I go to the store to get my bag of dog food, I take him. I go, you carry my bag of dog food. I'm handing my bag to him. And I'm giving that baggage on, moving it on to him. What I need to do is sit it down. I need to put it at Jesus' feet. And I need to say, here you go. Take my bag of dog food. I'm going to get more. Trust me. It's going to come. Right? But that bag I need to send to him. So I have to take that inventory. I have to figure out what's in my bag of dog food. And it's not a comfortable process. It's not something that you want to, hey, I'm going to sit down today and knock this out, right? It's not going to happen right away. But just as David asked God to search his heart and test his thoughts and point out those things within him that made God sad in Psalm 139, we need to do this for ourselves. We need to do it if we're going to receive all the joy that God has intended for us. So on your handout there, the first thing we need to do is search our hearts. So we do this by evaluating our relationships with others. In Matthew 6, verses 12 through 14, Jesus tells us to pray, forgive us our sins, just as we have forgiven those who have sinned against us. Don't bring us into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. So my question to you would be, have you forgiven those who have sinned against you? Or do you hold a grudge? Do you seek revenge? Are you jealous of somebody? Are you trying to justify these actions by pointing your finger? In Malachi, God says that he hates divorce, and I believe that he does. But God's statement is not just about the state of matrimony, it's the state of the believers, and it's the state of them divorcing themselves from their faith and from each other. Fortunately, we all have the power to rebuild that faith and rebuild those relationships with the help of God. So who do you need to forgive? It might be a family member or a friend or an acquaintance that you don't see anymore. It could be multiple people, and it could be yourself. I know that I have a lot of people to forgive. I need to forgive my mom and dad. I need to forgive myself. I need to forgive myself for believing that I was the problem. And I need to forgive myself for finding a solution that left me without a mother. And I also need need to forgive myself for handing my bag of dog food to my son. Then we need to test our thoughts. So who can tell me what the most difficult thing in the world is to open? Take a guess. It's not Tupperware. It's a closed mind. Romans 12:2 tells us, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. So when I read that, I think of that phrase, garbage in, garbage out, right? If we are absorbing unhealthy things through our eyes, through our ears, those are the things that we're going to put out. They'll work our way into our hearts. They'll work our way into our words. So we need to make sure that what we're bringing in is what God needs us to put out. And then the third thing on there, identify what makes God sad. So as we get closer to Easter, we're going to be reminded of the story of Jesus coming back to Jerusalem, his triumphant entry into the city. And the crowds are celebrating as he comes in. They're laughing and they're cheering and they're just having a great time. And what was Jesus doing? He was weeping. As he entered this city that was so excited to have him there, he wept over it. The crowd was whipped into a frenzy, and Jesus was weeping. They were rejoicing, and Christ was sobbing. So why did he weep as he saw Jerusalem? Because he knew that these people who today were shouting out, Hosanna, shortly would be shouting out, crucify him. He knew that one of his handpicked disciples would betray him. He knew that another disciple would deny him. He had healed their sick. He had raised their dead. He had cleansed their illnesses. He had fed their hungry. He had forgiven their sins. And for the most part, he had been rejected. John 1:11 says, he came to his own, and his own did not receive him. And so he wept. This broke his heart, and it still does. Unbelief and rejection breaks God's heart because he knows the consequences for us. So what are your next steps? Number 1, forgive someone. So you can start with this one today. And again, it's not going to happen overnight. But when you go home today or tonight before you go to sleep, think about one person that you need to forgive and ask God to help you forgive that person. It's not going to be easy, and it may not be something that you want to do, but it is something that's going to free you. Talking about the Holocaust, I saw a video not long ago of one of the Mengele twins. And if you're not familiar with Joseph Mengele, he was a Nazi doctor. And he was, Hitler wanted to find the perfect race. Well, Joseph Mengele did experiments on people to find that perfect race. And he loved twins because he could experiment on these twins. So a woman who was one of Mengele's twins was talking, and how she had dealt with her Holocaust experience as she got older was she would go out and she would talk about it. And at one of these talks that she was at, they had invited one of the Nazi guards from Auschwitz to be there also. Now, she wasn't prepared for that, and when they told her, she said, I can't do this. I can't talk to him. I just can't. And so she didn't talk that day. Later on, she decided she wanted to meet with him, and so she met with the Nazi guard, and she talked to him about the experience. And she talked to him about what he did and what his role was during the Holocaust. And she left there and she said, okay, that's great, fine for me. Well, a few years later, she was able to meet up with him again. They actually had gone back to Auschwitz, and the two of them walked through the camp together. And he talked about his role, and she talked about her experience, and they went to the places they had been. And when she got home, she said she felt very strongly that she had to let him know that he was forgiven. And she wrote him a letter, and she told him that she forgave him. Now, if she can do that, I think that we can find that person we need to forgive, and we can do that also. The second thing there is to concentrate on the positive truths of the Bible. When we fail to make God our priority, we become indifferent to, we neglect, and we show disrespect for God and His Word, just like our Israelites are doing. Romans 12:1 tells us to offer ourselves as living sacrifices, but what does that really mean? It means that with God helping you, you can take your everyday, ordinary life. You're sleeping, you're eating, you're going to work, you're walking around life, and you can place it before God as an offering. Embrace whatever God has given you, what He has done for you, and honor Him in all that you do. So I have a friend on Facebook who every morning and every night posts things, and she posts what she's grateful for. And it's, I'm grateful for the sunshine. I'm grateful for the rain. I'm grateful for the flowers. I'm grateful for the color pink. Whatever it is, she has these grateful things. It's her everyday life that she's grateful for. Yesterday morning, I thought about her. I was taking my son to yoga. So he's a swimmer. And he has every day of the week, 7 days of the week, we have to be somewhere pretty much by 6 o'clock in the morning. Now, he, unfortunately, is not a morning person. It didn't work out for him. So he tends to be a little grouchy in the morning. And usually on our trips to the pool or to yoga, it's quiet because we know he's grouchy, and so we just, okay, just have a great day. See you later. So yesterday, he had to get his yoga mat from one vehicle and move it to the other vehicle, and that just was not what he wanted to do. And so we just had this whole, why do I have to move my yoga mat, and blah, 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 blah. And I just get in the car, we're going, we need to leave now. And as we're driving, it's simmering in my head, and I'm going, oh, it's a yoga mat. And I thought about my friend on Facebook, and I said to myself, you know what? I'm grateful for his yoga mat. I am grateful that he is sitting next to me. I'm grateful for this truck that I'm driving in. I'm grateful that we're going to yoga, and by the time I got there, I felt so much better just by being grateful about having the chance to do those things. It made me feel so much better. Now, he felt better later on. He eventually got over it. It took him a little longer, but he eventually got over it. So when you go home again today, thank God for your everyday, ordinary life, for those things that you get to do every single day. Thank Him in the morning, thank Him at night. Make it a habit, not a have to. And then the third thing on there is run the race and keep the faith. One of my favorite verses in the Bible is 2 Timothy 4:7. I have it tattooed on my arm over here in honor of my brother-in-law. So my husband's youngest brother was a firefighter in Delaware, and he died in the line of duty on September 24th, 2016. And when we went out there, we had funerals, we had all kinds of things that we had to do. And we went out, we were there for a while, and at no point did anybody ever say why. Because we all knew that Jay was a man of great faith. And that this was his reward. He had done what God called him to do. He became a firefighter because that was his way of helping others and sharing the love of God with them. And so when God took him home, it wasn't a question of why, or this is too soon, or what's going on. It was just he had run his race. He had kept his faith, and God rewarded him. So we see in Malachi, the Jews were constantly questioning God. They're always asking him why and what and when, right? And this reminds me of another book in the Bible that I mentioned earlier too, which is the book of Job. So at the start of Job's story, Satan and God, they're having a conversation, and Satan tells God that I can turn every believer against you, right? And so God, I imagine, since we're made in God's image and we have a sense of humor, God must have a pretty good sense of humor. So I imagine God going, hey, Jesus, come here. Hold this holy water for a second and watch this one, right? And he tells Satan, here's my servant Job. You go for it. And Satan takes Job and puts him through the ringer, him and his family. He puts him out in the wilderness as far as they can get, right? And Job he's just like, oh my goodness, what's going on? Why is this happening to me? But instead of turning to the world to answer that question, he turns to God to answer that question. And when he does, God answers him. And God comes down and he's in a whirlwind and he bombards Job, right? And through this storm, as he's telling Job, this is why, Job's attitude changes from defensive and challenging to contented. And Job's response to God in Job 40, verse 5, takes my breath away when he says, oh, my God, I have heard of you, and now I see you. In the coming week, we're going to see in Malachi this description of the coming of the Lord. And I don't know about you, but I have this vision of the Lord coming, and it goes something like this. I'm in line, right? I'm waiting to get up there, and God's up at the front. And I don't want to be like the Israelites when they get up there, because I have a feeling they get up there and God goes, well, who are you? How do you know me, right? I don't want God to question how I know him. I want God to be in the front of the line and go, whoa, wait a second. Oh, there's Donna. She's here. She made it, right? And I want him to call me up, and I want him to put his arms around me, and I want him to say, you are home. You are here. I want to have that Job moment. I want to be able to look at God, and I want to be able to say, my God, I have heard you. And now here you are, and I see you. And that's it. That's it. That's the end of my story. That's what I want. That's where the final period goes. So let's take a minute and pray. God, I just want to thank you for bringing all these women together today and bringing them to study your word and to learn from you about how we can take our everyday, ordinary lives and honor you and glorify you with those, God. We know that we're not perfect, and we know that we don't deserve the grace that you give us every day. But yet, you still pursue us. You still give us that grace. You stand at that door and you knock. And I would ask that every woman in this room open that door, God, and invite you in. I don't know what's going on in everyone's life, but I know that you do. And so I lift everyone up to you for healing. I lift them up to you for the love and the peace that only you can provide. And God, I ask that you show us how to love others as you love us, so that we can be your hands and feet in this world, and we can go out and we can tell people that we have heard you, God, and that at the end of it all, we will see you. We love you, God. Amen.